Good afternoon, everyone, and I would like to welcome you all to today's webinar, which is titled The Right Time to Move. My name is Gillian, and I'm the Contractor Care Specialist here at Berkeley Recruitment. I'm joined today by Sean Pickett, who's the Business Development Manager at Icon Accounting. Sean is going to thrill us with his in-depth knowledge all about moving from an umbrella company to a personal limited company. Please don't be shy in asking any questions. We would encourage you to ask questions and use the Q&A function rather than the chat function. Jump in with your questions at any time and we will hopefully answer all of them at the end of the session. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Sean.
Thanks a million. Lovely intro, to be fair, Gillian. Hopefully I can back it up now in terms of the slides that I've got prepared for everyone. And again, I suppose the idea was that we won't spend too much time on the slides, but we will hopefully give everyone a good understanding as to what they need to consider, I suppose, before they make the switch to a personal limited company. So again, just before we kick off, my email is on the screen. I know that obviously Gillian will touch on it as well at the end. If there's any questions, I suppose, that we cannot answer, or that I suppose we don't have time to answer at the end, please feel free to follow up with us and we will make sure that we do get them answered. But we'll get started by having a quick look at the agenda. So again, obviously the topic is moving from an umbrella company to a personal limited company, which we'll look at in more detail. When is the right time? Why make the move? What are the additional benefits, if any? And again, I suppose, what additional flexibility does it provide? We're going to have a quick summary, and then, as Gillian touched on as well, the Q&A function, feel free to populate that at any stage throughout the presentation. We'll make sure that we do our best to get to all of the questions that have been asked. So just to touch on it first, moving from an umbrella company to your own personal limited company should be a seamless experience. So that's the most important thing for everyone to take away from the call, is that it should be seamless. Regardless of who your provider is, there should be no interruption in pay, or there should be no interruption in service, essentially. The only real difference that will happen is the case that you will now be invoicing from a different company name, and you will obviously be in control of that company name. The one thing I would say, again, to approach with caution is the fact that it's not something that can happen overnight, unfortunately. And again, that's not down to your local accountant or your service provider, whether it's Icon Accountant or anyone. There's actually a backlog, I suppose, from the CRO perspective. So although you can have a certificate of incorporation, which will confirm your new company name in the space of about 7 to 10 working days, you're looking at a full 4 to 8 weeks, essentially. And I know that there's a bit of a gap between them, but unfortunately, that's also, I suppose, derived by revenue delays and I suppose revenue backlog, as well as the CRO. So the main thing to take into account is that if you're considering the switch, you need to give yourself a full kind of 4 to 8 weeks. So it could essentially be 2 invoices if you're billing monthly before your company is fully ready to use. And again, although you'll have your certificate of incorporation back within 7 to 10 days, it's the actual tax registration that happens after you've got the certificate of incorporation that causes the vast majority of that delay. It's also worth noting, and again, before we go any further, I suppose, it's just to make sure that everyone is aware of it. If you're currently on a stamp 1G, unfortunately, the personal limited company option is not going to be applicable to you at this stage. However, when you do progress to a stamp 4, that's when you can consider obviously opening up the private limited company. So when is the right time? Again, it completely depends on your own personal circumstances, to be honest. So I know I've probably answered this very much like a politician, and I try not to do that, but you are definitely best positioned to answer that question. And the reason being is it depends on your own personal circumstances. What's right for one person may be completely different for another, even though they're on the same daily rate, the same contract length, and another couple of obviously varying parts. From Icon Accountant's perspective, what we typically advise is, again, utilize the umbrella company if it's your very first time contracting. If you've tasted contract, and if you've been in a contract and you're now looking at an extension, absolutely consider the personal limited company as an option for yourself. But why I would say, I suppose, to consider the umbrella company first and foremost is you'll have a dedicated account manager for queries. It gives you an opportunity to kind of get used to what contracting is all about before you take, I suppose, the biggest step into the personal limited company option. Apologies, what have I done here? The next one is you've got less administrative duties as a umbrella contractor. Without a shadow of a doubt, there's going to be less administrative duties put on you, regardless of who your provider is. There will be certain, I suppose, additional administrative duties that you'll have if you're operating through your own personal limited company. There's also less responsibility on you, essentially, with regards to providing details, with regards to your year-end returns. And we'll touch on this a little bit later in the slideshow as well. And as well as that, to give everyone full transparency, unlike an umbrella company solution where it's free to use, free to set up, free to leave, There is a cost to set up a private limited company, and there's also a cost to close a private limited company. So it's important that everyone kind of goes into it knowing that straight away, that there is costs involved. What I would say to everyone is, if you are considering making a change, it's not a change, or it's not a choice essentially, and a decision that you have to make on your own. Your accountant should be able to advise you based on your circumstances. So again, they'll see how much tax you're paying, they'll see how much of an invoice you're processing on a monthly basis, and as well as that, the different types of expenses that you're processing through your contract role. So definitely reach out to your account manager or your accountant, whatever the case may be, and they'll examine it and discuss it in more detail. And we'll also have a look at the most common reasons that Icon Accountant, I suppose, experience from our clients as to why they decide to make the switch, and we'll look at that a little bit later on. There are also another couple of differences. So I know I've touched on a little bit more admin as one of the points that I made in the previous slide. But the first thing I would say is that both of them are private limited company structures. So when you're accepting a contract role in Ireland, the first thing that you'll be asked for basically is to make sure that you're set up in a private limited company structure. So the personal limited company is a private limited company structure, and we call it a personal limited company internally. So apologies if I'm confusing anyone switching back and forward between them. But the personal limited company, the reason we call it personal is it's personal to you. It's your company essentially. The umbrella company, again, is perfect as a private limited company structure. So just keep that in mind that they are the same. The things that you will see different in a personal limited company setup to what you already get in your umbrella company is the fact that you'll be, I suppose, responsible first and foremost for choosing the company name. You'll also have to consider the time it takes to set up. So as I touched on, it can take anywhere between 4 to 8 weeks. 4 is definitely on everything swimmingly, your first choice name being accepted, for example. If it's a case that you select a name that's already been taken, or there's another name out there that's quite similar, the likelihood is the CRO will come back and basically ask you to change your name or to give another couple of variations as to how the name can be displayed. Again, you've got to also consider the fact that in an umbrella setup, in an umbrella solution, when you're utilizing that, you can get paid directly into your own personal bank account as part of CRO legislation. So it's actually company law in Ireland that if you are going to be operating through your own personal limited company, a business bank account is a requirement. So again, keep that in mind. It's something you can do after you've received your certificate of incorporation. That's when you can start your business bank application. And that, again, depending on the provider that we'll touch on a little bit later again, can take anywhere between 2 and 3 weeks, or it can take as little as 2 and 3 hours. So we'll touch on a couple of tips later on that side. Another thing that you have to take into account is you're going to have to, I suppose, appoint a company secretary. Now, there can be a couple of queries around the company secretary piece. The legislation typically, I suppose, and it does set out that it has to be someone that's qualified to be a company secretary. What I would say to you is, in my experience, an awful lot of the time, someone will appoint a close family member. And the reason being, I suppose, is that from a company secretary perspective, in terms of their duties and obligations that they'll come across throughout the course of the year, it will be a signature from time to time that they'll have to basically turn around and, I suppose, provide on the company documents. So whether it be the year-end return, your first P1, your secretary is going to be required. So if it's a case that you're thinking of appointing someone that's living in a different country, I would advise against it and keep it close to the family wherever possible. There are also third-party providers out there essentially that will offer company secretarial services, as well as the next point, which is the registered business address. There's a couple of things to touch on with the registered business address. Likewise, again, you're more than entitled to use your own business home address, your own home address as your business address. The one thing I would just again advise people is if you have any kind of, I suppose, reservations about having your personal details available to people online, I would again suggest kind of considering the third party option, where you can basically utilize whether it be a PO box address or if it's a satellite address essentially that you're using for your registered business address. Because when you do incorporate your personal limited company, private limited company, it will be a case that them details are available to people online. I'd love to turn around and tell you that it's only certain people that can access it, but essentially it's anyone that's willing to pay the subscription fee for the service offering. So for example, if again, internally we have it so we can do some, I suppose, due diligence on clients before we sign up to them if they're already an existing company. But it's a case where I can go on and check the registered address essentially of a business and also the registered address of a director. So just to keep that in mind, and that is an option obviously to outsource that service. The other thing again to keep in mind is the Class S PRSI and the income tax return. If you're utilising a director umbrella solution at this moment in time, this is essentially the same as what you've already had to do under the director umbrella. However, if you're under a POE umbrella company, this will be new to you. And as a company director, first and foremost, your Class S PRSI is going to be different to what you're used to paying in Class A. And as well as that, you're also going to be obliged to complete an income tax return. Now, again, a good accountancy practice will offer that as part of the fully managed service, like we do at Icon Accounting. So it's not something you actually have to kind of worry about as such, but it's something you should be aware about, definitely, if you're considering obviously making the switch. I suppose this slide is kind of dedicated to the most common reasons as to why we see people making the switch to a personal limited company. It does provide further tax efficiency, that goes without saying. And I'll again, hopefully, I suppose, demonstrate that in another couple of slides in terms of pay examples and pay slips, similar to what we've done in the first Lunch and Learn session, but it definitely can provide further tax efficiency. The next one would be employing a family member, which again can be quite popular. So if it's a case that you are the sole earner in a household, it may be a case where you actually have an opportunity to become further tax efficient by employing someone else in the family. Again, there's certain restraints that we would always advise to our clients that are looking to do this. The first of which is essentially to keep the pay in line with the duties being performed. So again, if it's a case where you're paying the company secretary, for example, if you were to pay the company secretary a salary of €40,000 per year, revenue would be quite stringent on that, and they'd be, I suppose, asking a lot more questions than if that salary was to be set out at 12,000 a year. On the other side of that, there's also benefits of obviously keeping it below the tax threshold, which would again fall into that kind of 12,000 bracket. Another popular reason that people do also make the switch from an umbrella company to their own personal private limited company is purchasing a company vehicle. Other than that, large business assets. So if it's a case where you're expanding your business, you've seen an opportunity essentially in the market, you're going to open up your own office space, or again, whether it's a case that you feel like that a company vehicle is required for you, purchasing them kind of assets is only allowed essentially through your own personal limited company. It's not an option through the umbrella company, for obvious reasons, that obviously there's a number of people utilizing an umbrella company, whereas when you set up your own personal limited company, it's your company that's going to own that car, and again, you have full authority and control over what that company does. It is also quite popular for people that are going into multiple business interests. So again, an awful lot of our clientele would be either, let's say, for example, investing in shares, investing in stocks. They'd also maybe be opening kind of a side business where they could be doing an e-commerce platform, or they could also be offering consultancy, I suppose, across the board. It again is very, very useful on that side of things. I touched on the investments piece outside of pensions, so that's the likes of investing in your shares, your stocks, and even, I suppose, the likes of cryptocurrency, which is again becoming more and more common. Also becoming more common essentially from a contracting standpoint that we've witnessed over the last 12 months is, especially if you're contracting for a startup firm or a small new firm, often they will try and obviously get the payment to kind of allocate a certain amount of shares, or whether the payment is being made in cryptocurrency. That isn't available through the umbrella company solution, and the reason being is because the banks aren't set up for it. Essentially, it's not something that the umbrellas are, I suppose, like I say, designated to do. So what we would advise to clients in that scenario is, if you're going to be accepting payments in any other currency other than traditional currency, doesn't necessarily, I suppose, have to be euro. It can be, it can be sterling, it can be dollar. But if you're going to move away from the actual physical currency and look at the likes of a cryptocurrency in terms of payment, I definitely advise looking at the personal limited company. There's another massive reason as to why you should consider a personal limited company. It's definitely the most popular internally with ourselves, and I'm not going to touch on it too much in this presentation. And the reason being is because we've actually got a whole episode designated to catching up on the 2 reliefs that are available to contractors through their personal limited company. The first of which is entrepreneurial relief, and the second of which is retirement relief. But if you're interested in tax efficiency, and if you're interested in keeping as much of the money that you earn as physically possible, I can't recommend obviously making sure that you're subscribed to the next Lunch and Learn session, which will be on the 14th, so next week. Another couple of things, like I say, so just to drill down a little bit further from, I suppose, them points that I made on how you can essentially achieve further tax efficiency. First and foremost, it's arguably the most popular reason that people make the switch, and that's completely understandably. Again, the reason that most people will switch is that they can kind of, I suppose, grab a hold and control the level of income that they're paying themselves on a monthly basis. More importantly, you can also have control over the level of income tax that you're paying as a result of obviously processing your payroll. So the main difference between the umbrella company and the personal limited company in that sense is, in an umbrella company structure, the total invoice value that you process on a monthly basis is basically processed as your payroll. So if you're on a high daily rate or a high hourly rate and you're processing quite a large invoice on a monthly basis, or even if it's a weekly basis, all of that money is going to be processed to you through payroll. Whereas if it's a case that you are going to be operating through a personal limited company, you can still process that large invoice on a monthly basis, but instead of processing 100% of the money received, you can decide, well, actually, I don't need to pay myself a salary of €8,000 per month. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to reduce my salary to reduce the level of income tax that I'm going to pay, and I'm going to store the remainder of them funds in my business bank account. And again, we've got a couple of examples on that later on in the presentation as well. The next piece, like I touched on, was employing a family member. The option to employ a family member is quite popular. Again, if it's a case where, like I say, I suppose, like I touched on the previous point, if it's a case where you're going to be retaining income as part of your business process on a monthly basis going forward, you will have additional funds essentially in your business bank account. If it's a case that you set the salary to make sense from an income tax perspective for the other person, it's definitely worthwhile considering. But there's also another couple of things to keep in mind. Again, as I touched on, the remuneration should be in line with the duties carried out, and it is an area where revenue are particularly stringent. And the other thing I would say is it will have an impact on their taxes. So if your, I suppose, family member is already working full-time in a different role, paying them, I suppose, an additional salary may not actually be efficient for anyone, because again, if they've already kind of utilized their tax band, if they've already utilized their tax credits, essentially you're just going to be paying tax. It's just going to be to a different person. So again, reach out to your advisor, obviously have a conversation if it is something that's going to be applicable to you, especially if you're a sole earner. One of the tips that I'd also give while I'm on this point is, if it's a case that you're going to employ a family member that's quite close, so let's say, for example, a partner, if you're going to employ your partner and they're currently not working, it's definitely worthwhile considering setting them up as a joint director and shareholder of the company. And the reason for that is, if you set up a personal limited company as a sole director, it means you have to appoint a separate company director. If you set up the company with two directors, it means that one of them directors can act as the company secretary too. But more importantly, from a payrolling perspective, if you're going to employ that person, if they're an equal shareholder in the new personal limited company, it means that you don't have to pay employers PRSI. So straight away, on top of the payroll that you pay someone, you're going to have employers PRSI at 11.05%. If they're an equal shareholder and a director of the company, that employer's PRSI isn't applicable, and therefore you're making a saving of 11.05% immediately. But again, they do have to be an equal shareholder and they do have to be a director. So on to the next point, purchasing a large business assets or a company vehicle. This is something that many long-term contractors obviously look to do to, again, utilize their tax efficiency, again, to take advantage, I suppose, of the generous BIK rates that have been applicable to electric vehicles in particular. There's also other options with regards to purchasing property. These are definitely both discussions that I would advise reaching out to your account manager or your point of contact. Again, if you're with Icon Accountant, it's something that your account manager will be able to help you with immediately. But the reason that I would advise reaching out to someone is essentially you have to take benefit in kind into consideration. So if you do have a company vehicle, or if you're going to be purchasing a company vehicle, benefit in kind is an additional tax essentially that you'll pay through your payroll. And the rate of benefit in kind can vary depending on the type of vehicle, the engine capacity, and another couple of things. So a salesperson in a garage may not be as upfront as you would hope and like them to be. I would always say, before you make any decision on purchasing a company vehicle, definitely reach out to your accountant, and they'll be able to verify it at the very minimum of the information that you've received from the person in the garage essentially selling you that car. The other thing that I would also take into account, and the reason I've listed this essentially as a second point to make, is that an awful lot of people, I suppose, when they first hear the conversation about moving to a personal limited company, it's almost well, Jesus, why haven't I done this before? Essentially, if I can become more tax efficient, and instead of paying so much income tax, I can keep that money aside in my business bank account and utilize it, I suppose, a little bit more creatively, and it's going to benefit me longer in the long run. One thing to keep in mind is, particularly if you're in the area of, or if you're interested in purchasing property, if you're going to purchase property through a business, so if it's going to be a case that your company is going to retain these funds that you're not paying yourself, save them funds up, and eventually go with the idea of purchasing a property that you can basically, whether it be a rental property or second property, if you're earning any income as a result of a property through your business or shares or stocks, your corporation tax rate is no longer 12.5%. The corporation tax rate on investment income is actually 25%, which can be a big difference, obviously. So what I would say to someone that's looking to purchase property, it's not necessarily a bad idea, but just be fully aware of the fact that your income that you receive as a result of your investment property is not going to be taxed at 12.5% corporation tax. Instead, it's going to be taxed at the higher investment income corporation tax, 25%. The other thing to keep in mind is capital gains tax. And what I mean by capital gains tax in this scenario is if your business is going to sell an asset, so whether that be the company vehicle or whether that be the property that it's purchasing, or even if it's going to be the shares and stocks, I suppose, that you're interested in, when you sell an asset in a company standpoint, you're also going to have to pay capital gains tax. Capital gains tax is typically taxed at 33%. So again, it's quite a hefty tax to forget about or to not think about when you're making these decisions, obviously. So again, even if it's a case where you're going out to purchase a company vehicle, you sell the company vehicle in 2 or 3 years' time, there is going to be an element of capital gains tax that you have to pay on the sale of that vehicle. So definitely something else to keep in mind. Just to move on to the investment piece outside of pensions, and again, I suppose that's more kind of where we were with regards to the shares and stocks. Similar to the above point, again, many independent professional contractors will look to invest in additional funds. This can be, again, by, like I say, reducing your payroll, storing them funds and retaining them profits in the business bank account, and then putting them to better use. Investment in corporation tax is 12.5%, sorry, it's not 12.5%, instead it's 25%, and that can be a deal breaker, obviously, if you're planning on becoming the next Warren Buffett. So definitely something else to keep in mind. And the biggest, I suppose, the biggest piece of advice I would give to anyone that's interested in investing through their private limited company is to have that conversation with your accountant and to make sure that you've also built in that 25% tax, that you're not basing it off a 12.5% calculation. Multiple business interests was another point that we touched on. So again, independent professionals are very often, and in most cases, in fairness, they're very good multitaskers. And as a result, plenty have additional business interests. So whether that be additional consultancy work, whether it be, again, what I would advise before we go any further on the additional consultancy work is to always check the contract. There are plenty of contracts out there that will restrict you to making sure, obviously, that you're putting your full time and focus onto that specific contract. And it will actually restrict you from, I suppose, utilizing or taking on additional opportunities in that same period of time. The other piece is the e-commerce business, which again is becoming more and more popular over the last couple of years, as you can imagine. And then there's also freelance work such as Fiverr or Upwork. Again, I would advise to check the contract on any consultancy work that you're going to be carrying out outside of what's already been agreed. Payments in cryptocurrency and shares. So again, as the rise in cryptocurrency, it tends to be kind of very, very off and on, to be honest. It's probably relating to the price or I suppose how strong the market is at that moment in time. But it's something that we've definitely seen more and more queries coming in over the last 12 to 18 months. Some clients will also offer payment in this format. Specifically, like I say, if you're dealing with a startup firm directly, if you're dealing with a startup company, they will often try and give you some shares as a kind of, I suppose, bonus to try and get you on board. An umbrella company is not set up, like I touched on, to facilitate such payments, and therefore a personal limited company is really your only option, to be honest, if they're going to be any kind of, I suppose, fluctuations in how they're going to pay you. They can often, like I say, try to seduce you by adding a share percentage as part of your payment. The umbrella company, unfortunately, wouldn't be able to have shares in the next Revolut as much as it would like to, but it isn't set up to facilitate such agreements. So just keep that in mind. If it's a case where you're going to be accepting payments in other formats other than traditional currency, the umbrella company is not going to be an option for you any longer, and therefore you'll have to make the switch to a personal limited company. If the previous slides, I suppose, haven't actually kind of taken your attention or, gotten you to sit up in your seat and think this is actually definitely something I should be doing, that's absolutely fine as well. There are pros and cons to weigh up and to consider before you make the final decision. The main additional benefits, though, in my opinion, are first and foremost, like I said, the opportunity to become even more tax efficient. So as we know at this stage, operating as an independent professional can be much more tax efficient than operating as an employee, even if you're carrying out the exact same role. You've got the likes of the business expenses that you can obviously submit, as well as that, obviously, the taxes are a little bit more kind of flexible in terms of your tax rate. Furthermore, employing a family member can increase the take-home pay for the overall household or family. So if you're the sole earner in the household, you can, like I say, process a second payroll. And as a result of processing that second payroll, you can also obviously get more money into your household in a more tax-efficient manner, rather than you kind of, I suppose, taking the additional salary and, again, going further past your tax band. The retained profits can definitely be put to good use. The best use they can be put to is going to be covered off next week in regards to the relief webinar that we have. So again, just to remind everyone, that's a webinar you don't want to miss next week. The company Tesla does sound nice. So I completely understand when people are thinking, oh, I'd like to get a company vehicle. It, again, is definitely something that has become more and more popular. One thing I would turn around and say, though, again, just to touch on that before we move on, is the fact that you should definitely reach out to verify the BIK rate before you make any commitment or decision in terms of purchasing a company vehicle. And again, a purchase is not only the only option, I should say. You've also got the option of like a lease agreement or a hire purchase agreement. BIK will still apply regardless as to whether you're purchasing, leasing, or even on a hire purchase agreement. But it definitely can, again, depend on, I suppose, what you're looking to do from a cash flow perspective. It can, I suppose, be beneficial to know that purchasing a vehicle outright is not the only option. You also have increased flexibility with business expenses. So how does that work? I suppose the main reason you will have increased flexibility with business expenses is when you operate under a personal private limited company, as much as your accountant will advise you on what you can process as an expense and what you can submit as an expense, unlike the umbrella company where the rules are quite strict, and the reason the rules are quite strict is to protect everyone else that's actually, I suppose, utilizing that umbrella company. It's strictly, I suppose, coherent with revenue guidelines, and there's very, very little movement. If it's a case that revenue are not saying it's not allowable, it's not allowable. Now, I'm not trying to tell anyone to try and submit expenses that aren't allowable, but what I would say to you is, if you are operating under a personal limited company or a private limited company, it's still the duty and obligation of your accountancy provider or your partner, essentially, to turn around and tell you what's allowable and what's not. But ultimately, the decision will be yours. So you do have full control and full autonomy to process whatever expenses you like. But again, the book will fall with you. So keep that in mind. Again, the release is going to be the big part. That's going to be something. And I suppose I'll just drop a little bit of a hint. I know I keep touching on the fact that you should join us next week. So I suppose I'll give you a little bit of a tease in terms of why you definitely should come. If it's a case that you're interested in, like I say, becoming as tax efficient as you possibly can be, the biggest benefit of entrepreneurial relief is it's a case where if you're going to be contracting for a period, if you're going to be contracting for a period of 3 to 5 years, you can basically, like I say, store up your funds. So if you're processing quite a large, I suppose, invoice on a monthly basis or weekly basis, instead of processing that all as payroll and basically paying a lot of income tax, you can reduce your payroll, reduce your salary to make sure that it's tax efficient from an income tax perspective, store the funds in the business bank account, and then obviously you can try and extract the funds from the business bank account. So entrepreneurial relief, the way that works is, if you're in the company for 3 years, you can extract the company funds at a tax rate effective of about 27%, which is massive. If you consider, obviously, the vast majority of independent professionals are above, I suppose, the first tax band of 20% rate. So the majority of contractors will be paying taxes, income taxes at about 50%. Therefore, if you're interested in becoming more tax efficient and taking as much of the money that you earn in your company out and transferring it across to yourself, entrepreneurial relief is definitely something you want to catch up with us on next week in Lunch and Learn 3. So last week, again, I suppose in the first Lunch and Learn session, we kind of gave an example of, well, what's the impact of processing business expenses on your payslip? And this is obviously probably one of the most important slides that I can do, because again, when it's on a payslip, people take notice. So this is an example of a payslip essentially of a contractor that's on €450 a day. They have a €500 pension contribution, and as a result of that, essentially the total income tax that they're paying, or the total income related taxes they're paying, is €3,188.13. So as you can see at the top of the screen, you've got 20 days at €450. You've got your allowable expenses, which is your pension, and then essentially you've got all your deductions on the right hand side here. As a result of these deductions, like I say, and if you do a quick tally on them, you're actually paying income taxes of €3,188, and you're coming out with about €5,671, even though your top line was €9,000. So again, you're paying €3,500 once, I suppose, you've deducted all of your fees, and you've also got your pension in there. If you compare this then to someone that's in a personal limited company on the same daily rate, so they're on the same rate of €450 a day, they again have the €500 pension contribution set up, but instead of processing the full payroll in this example, what this client has decided to do is to set themselves a salary of €72,000 per year. As a result of setting the salary of €72,000 per year, they've got a monthly pay of €6,000. Now, what that'll do first and foremost is it will have an impact. It will reduce your net payment at the end of the month, but it will also turn around and significantly reduce the amount of income tax that you're paying. So again, if you compare it back to the previous slide, I'm going to do a quick calculation in terms of the differences in income tax paid. You're going to pay basically $1,561 less income tax. Your difference in take-home pay is going to be $1,473. But the other main difference, not to forget, is the fact that you will actually have an additional €3,000 stored in your business bank account. So again, is it worthwhile storing €3,000 to save or to basically earn another €1,500? it will be a case-by-case basis. And that's why I suppose at the very start of the presentation, the first piece of advice I would give you is reach out and have a discussion with your accountant, reach out and have a discussion with your provider or your dedicated point of contact within Icon, and they'll very quickly be able to advise if it's something that you're, I suppose, on the right track of. But definitely something to keep in mind. And I think personally this slide is massive. If it, again, from a personal perspective, if I was to put myself in the position of an independent professional contractor, I would definitely be more interested in having €3,000 on my business bank account than it being in revenue's account. And again, me having no access to that in the future. So we're going to talk about, obviously, next week, how we can get that €3,000 out very tax efficiently through entrepreneurial relief or even retirement relief. And again, that's going to be at a tax rate effectively at about 27% in comparison, obviously, to what you're experiencing at about 50%. So just to summarize, obviously, before we kind of move on to the questions piece as well, top 4 tips for anyone that is considering making the switch. If you aren't sure, speak to your provider and they can advise based on your scenario. I would also turn around and say that from my perspective, there's no real minimum daily rate that you should be on. There's no real minimum contract length that you should be on. For example, I would turn around and say that, okay, if it's your first time contracting, utilize the umbrella company. But if you know after 3 months of being in that umbrella company that actually contracting really does suit me with the flexibility and the business expenses, I would not turn around and basically tell someone, no, you should be waiting until you're 12 months in a contract before you move into a personal limited company solution. Absolutely not the case. Again, on a case-by-case basis, I would advise it. So speak to your provider, speak to your dedicated point of contact, and they'll be able to advise based on your scenario. And that's the most important thing I can get across. Remember that there will be likely some additional work associated. Again, with a good provider such as Icon Accounting, excuse the plug. No, all jokes aside, with any of the good providers essentially that are out there in the market, you will have some additional work regardless of your setup. But if you're partnered with the right partner, an awful lot of this work can be taken away from you, such as the likes of the company secretarial work, the likes of your year-end returns, your VAT returns. The only thing essentially that the accountant cannot do for you is set up a business bank account. And again, I'll give you a quick tip on that before we do, I suppose, switch on to the questions. The other thing to consider, obviously, as well, from that last slide where we were saving €3,000 in the business bank account, that's all well and good. That's absolutely fantastic. You also have to remember that that's not tax-free, essentially. It's not going to stay €3,000 throughout the course of the year forever. If you save €3,000 on a monthly basis, at the end of the year, you're going to have 36,000 in retained profits over a 12-month period. That 36,000 will still be applicable to corporation tax. So again, there is going to be tax that has to be deducted from that amount, but it's still an awful lot less than what your income tax would be, particularly if you're on that kind of a rate and you're processing a big payroll already. And the other big tip I can give you is, like I said, log into the next Lunch and Learn session to obviously find out more about the reliefs. You really don't want to miss this one because, again, if you're interested in becoming more tax efficient, which everyone is, it's something that can be very, very useful to know and know as early as possible because, like I say, there is a minimum qualification period that has to be, I suppose, met first and foremost. So you don't want to find out a year too late, or you don't want to waste a year essentially where you could have been saving for the entrepreneurial relief. So definitely tune in next week. The other tip I'll give you just before I hand back to Gillian, because I know we do have a couple of questions that we want to go through. The other tip I will give you is if it's something you're considering, business bank account applications can be a little bit, I suppose, tedious at times. There is obviously multiple brick and mortar options available to you. There's also another option if it's a case where you're trying to get set up as quickly as possible. From my own experience and from dealing with clients over the last 12 to 18 months, Revolut Business Bank, it may not be suitable for everyone depending on how many transactions you've got coming in and out of that bank. It can be quite expensive in some scenarios, I believe. But what I can say about it is it's quick, it's painless, it's digital, and it's all online. So definitely something to consider if it's a case where you're trying to set up a business bank account application meeting with one of the brick and mortar banks and they're coming back to you saying, we actually haven't got any availability for 2 to 3 weeks. You're not stuck. You can also go to the likes of Revolut Business. But again, you'll see my details on screen. We'll also make sure that, I suppose, we get them across to you after in the recording. If anyone has any additional questions, whether you're a client of Icon Accounting or not, I'd be more than happy to help. You can reach me on my email at sean@iconaccounting. And again, a massive thank you, obviously, to everyone that joined us today. And massive thank you to Berkeley, obviously, for having me as well. So I'm going to stop my screen share now, Gillian, if that's okay with you. And hopefully we'll be able to go through a couple of the questions.
Thanks, Sean. That was excellent. It was very insightful. You absolutely lived up to my introduction, no doubt about it. There's been lots of questions come in. Hopefully I'll get through them all, but if I don't, what we'll do is we'll make sure that anyone who has raised a question will reach out to you with the answer to it. So one of the first questions we got is that this individual is new to the whole contracting process, and they wanted to know what the benefits are to being a contractor as opposed to just accepting a permanent position.
Okay, so in my opinion, to be 100% honest, and I say in my opinion, I don't mean to sound like a politician again there, but what I would say is the facts that you can look at straight away is you do have more flexibility to become tax efficient. Typically, you'll also have more flexibility in terms of the role and the duties that you're carrying out as an independent professional. But I'd also turn around and openly say the contracting isn't for everyone. It's not something that suits everyone. Some people may be better suited in a employee kind of, I suppose, setup. Whereas there are a very large percentage, and it's a growing percentage, to be honest, that are definitely going to benefit from an independent professional contracting setup. What I would say to someone that's, I suppose, new to the process or considering a contract opportunity, reach out to a couple of the providers. They'll basically give you an idea behind the scenes as to what being a contractor is really like. But more importantly, they'll also be able to do some pay estimates for you based on your contract opportunity, and they'll be able to compare that against the permanent employment opportunity. So focus on the remuneration first and foremost. Is it going to be worth your while in your pocket? Then after that, you can start asking all the other questions as to whether it's going to suit you, and I suppose a flexibility concept as well.
Fantastic. Sure, because it's all about the money at the end of the day anyway, isn't it?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Absolutely. So one of the next questions we have is from Kevin, and he wants to know, how do you register a separate business address or PO box?
So there are I suppose there's several services out there, to be honest, Kevin. Again, a good question. It's something that you can, I suppose, Google first and foremost. I wouldn't advise one over any other provider in the market, to be honest. But as soon as you register, I suppose if you start to register business address service or company address services, you'll get a list of providers that are available to you. The way that works basically is then any post that's forwarded to your business at that address is automatically forwarded onto your home address. So if you're interested in kind of keeping your home address away from the business, it's definitely something I'd advise, and it can be quite reasonable. There's monthly options in terms of paying, and there's yearly, annual, I suppose, billing as well. So definitely something to consider, but I wouldn't actually, I suppose, have one recommendation over another. Just do a quick Google search on business address services, and you'll soon find a number of different providers and reach out to them all to get the best deal for yourself.
Great. There's plenty of options there anyway for people, and loads of information available on it. Now, I think you touched on this already. There was a question on, is there BIK on commercial vehicles? But I think you covered that in the slide anyway. Loads of people always have the benefit in kind question, don't they?
Absolutely, absolutely. And unfortunately, obviously, in the last budget, we've seen an increase in the electrical vehicle BIK. Up until last year, it was 0%. So the reason you'll see so many new kind of Teslas out there on the road is because a lot of them are company people, obviously, that have taken advantage of that BIK rate. It is, I suppose, it has been increased in the last budget. What I would advise first and foremost, though, before committing to any vehicle purchase, is just verify the information that you're receiving from the car dealership, essentially, with your accountant or with someone essentially that has knowledge. Again, the revenue website will have a breakdown of the different BIK rates, but if it's a case where you feel more comfortable reaching out to your accountant, please do that before you make a commitment.
Okay, fantastic. And then another question from Kevin actually as well. He has asked, is there an optimum salary you should take to maximize your return?
Absolutely, absolutely. Again, it'll depend on your own individual kind of tax credits and scenario. But I always say if it's a case where you can live as close to that first 20% tax band, that's where you should be, I suppose, trying to optimize it. Now, again, it's a case where obviously inflation is a very real thing at the moment. There's a substantial rise in the cost of living. So again, moving to a personal or private limited company should not, I suppose, suffer. You shouldn't suffer as a result of it, essentially. It shouldn't be a case that you're now struggling. You know, you're now setting a payroll that you're going to struggle to get by on. If that is the case, it's not going to be a benefit. It's going to cause more stress and pressure than it is actual benefit at the end of the day. But what I would say is, again, you will have the option to fluctuate your salary on a monthly basis. So if you have a specific kind of event coming up, I know I have communion coming up in May for my little man. So again, if you have the option to kind of fluctuate your salary on a monthly basis, you can do that. Christmas time is obviously an expensive time for people. So again, if it's a case where you can kind of live to your means, essentially for a period of the year without actually kind of struggling, I'd recommend doing that by keeping as close as you can to that 20% tax band. And if you reach out to your accountant, they should be able to do a number of samples for you that will show you your salary at whether it be 40,000 a year, 50,000 a year, 60,000 a year, and they'll be able to provide to you exactly what your net pay will be on each of them salaries. So don't be afraid to reach out in that aspect either.
Okay, excellent. Another question I have here is from Barry, and he wants to know, are there any additional costs as part of a changeover from an umbrella to a PLC?
There definitely are. And again, I suppose when we speak to any clientele that are currently in an umbrella company with ourselves, it's one of the first things that we try and make very, very transparent to them is there is a cost to set up the company, but also there's a cost to close down the company. So if it's a case where, for example, you think, okay, love the idea of paying less tax, love the idea of having better, tax efficiency. It's a case where it's worthwhile setting it up, but it's also make sure you take into account that there's going to be a cost to close it down. So if a permanent opportunity comes up in 12 months time and you exit contracting essentially and you weren't planning to do so, you are going to have a cost associated with doing that. It's a €300 cost if you have no business assets, whereas it gets more expensive essentially if you've got the likes of a company vehicle or company property. It can go anywhere up to 3,000, 6,000, depending on what you've got left in the business to liquidate. So again, have the conversation before you take on that additional expense. The only other expense I could think of, Gillian, and apologies to be long-winded in this answer, but the only additional expense that will, I suppose, come up is there's a slight difference in terms of the management fee for a personal limited company over an umbrella company structure. That's just because there's more admin, there's more, I suppose, returns that need to be completed, but it is very, very small. To put it into perspective, I suppose for everyone on the call, essentially, you're looking at a difference of about €2 per week over the course of the year in terms of having your personal limited company. As well as that, not to put anyone off with the cost of setting it up and closing it down, my own personal opinion is if you utilize the I suppose salary correctly, it'll be a case where the cost of setting up and the cost of closing is completely covered in 1 to 2 payrolls. So it will be tax efficient. Even if you do close within the first 12 months, you'll be able to basically make that tax back on tax that you would have paid to revenue.
Okay, excellent. Now, another question we have here is with regards to pension. If a person has an existing pension and they obviously transfer from an umbrella to a PLC, do they have to start that pension over again, or can they transfer their pot into? 100%
they can transfer it. It's not a case where you have to start the process again. It may be a case where you basically have to sign one of the forms that you've signed as part of your umbrella setup in the first place. That'll basically just be changed over to the new company name. But again, I suppose your pension provider should be able to do that very, very quickly and painlessly for you as well. So it's not a case where you're starting again, you're transferring it across.
Okay, that's brilliant. So they're not going to lose out, which is essentially the main thing. I have another question from Laura. She's in the middle of applying for a mortgage at present. So if she, again, changes from an umbrella to a PLC, will that affect her mortgage application, or will the process still be straightforward?
Very, very good question. Again, I would say on a case-by-case basis, to be honest, it completely depends on what stage you're at, Laura. And look, I'll provide as much transparency as I can. If you were to turn around and open up a personal limited company with the idea of reducing your salary, that will have an impact on your mortgage application. If it's a case where you're nearly at the drawdown stage, so let's say you've done the hard work, you've done all the saving, all you need to show the bank now essentially is consistency. In that scenario, I would say completely wait until your mortgage is drawn down or until the purchase has happened, and then make the switch across. But if it's a case that you're very close to that drawdown date, I wouldn't make the switch personally. I would stay where I am, and then I'd look at becoming further tax efficient once I've got the mortgage ticked off, because it could be the case, depending on your mortgage provider or depending on the lender, where they turn around and say, okay, well, technically you've moved to a new position from our standpoint, you now have to do the 6 months, or you now have to do, whatever the period of time, I suppose, that they have set out. So definitely reach out to your advisor before you do it. If you're going to reduce your salary, it will have an impact. And the third point I would make is, if it's a case where you're close to the drawdown date, it's not worth risking it. Get your mortgage done, get your mortgage drawn down, and then look at switching across afterwards.
Yeah, that's excellent advice. I mean, it's hard enough to get a mortgage and start the whole process in the first place without adding any further complications. There's no doubt about that.
Absolutely, yeah. Without having to do it again.
Yeah. So one of the last questions we have is, it's from David, and he wants to know, does he need company insurance with regards PLC?
Again, to be honest, this will be down to your actual client. It's definitely available to you. So you can basically, obviously, with Icon Accounting, and again, with many of the providers out there, there's often group insurance in place. So if you are setting up a personal limited company with Icon Accounting, for example, there is insurance options available to you. If you're already in an umbrella company, it's likely that the insurance is built into the price already. So it is available to you. But I suppose the true answer to that question is, it will depend on your client whether insurance is required. In 99% of cases, insurance is required, but it should be something that your provider can organise for you, even in a personal limited company setup.
Okay, okay. Well, listen, that was amazing and really insightful, loads of information, and it was great to see so many questions come through as well from all our participants. So thank you to everybody. Thank you to Sean for his wonderful knowledge. Brilliant as always. And we look forward to seeing you all back here again next week for our entrepreneurial relief. That's a bit of a tongue twister. Could we not? I mean, that is a wee bit of a tongue twister now, isn't it? And like Sean said, he gave his information, but you can contact him via Icon Accounting. And please, if any of your questions weren't answered, please feel free to reach out to myself, Gillian Buckley, and you'll get me at berkeley-group.ie. So thanks as always, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon, guys.
Thanks again.
Thank you.